Poor bodies, queer bodies, female bodies, and racialized bodies are often not valued as much as other bodies, at least not in our 20th century Mormonism. Mormonism does not believe these errant bodies can perform Mormonism sufficient for them to have power, much less to define Mormonism. If these bodies were to be given power, Mormonism would cease to be Mormonism, or rather, it would be a different kind of Mormonism, far different than our contemporary Mormonism. And Mormonism cares very deeply about the kind of Mormonism that it is. This too is a feature, not a bug. For you see in its history, Mormonism was not always performed in the way that contemporary Mormonism is performed. In the past, to be a Mormon meant being and doing things that were profoundly at odds with what the rest of the world considered good and proper and right. America is also deeply concerned with what it considers good and proper and right behavior. Though Mormonism has always been deeply concerned about the way that Mormon bodies perform, the way that our current performance of Mormonism came to be, and the regulatory structures, the biopolitical engines, which regulate the way the saints are allowed to live and to act and to exist in the world, these regulatory structures and the performance they encourage began to take shape at the end of Mormonism's transition beyond polygamy in the early 20th century. You see, Mormons from the very beginning were in tension with the Americans. In one of those rare messianic moments in time, as the people who would experience it would later attest, the divine, the transcendent, the all-surpassing and all-confusing came down and animated the bodies of some people in upstate New York who before had been good Americans. And these bodies, these God-touched bodies, became the first Mormons. And these first Mormons in their bodies did not perform in the world like the Americans believed that good Americans should behave. And for this, the Americans chased the Mormons from place to place. The Americans persecuted the Mormons. After the Mormons tried for some time to defend the Mormon way of being as an alternative and good way for an American to be, they failed to impress the Americans. The Mormons decided they would rather be Mormons than Americans. They fled the country rather than continue trying to be Americans. And yet the Americans found them again. And the Americans still did not believe the Mormons could be both Mormons and good Americans. The Americans felt they could not live peacefully with Mormons behaving the way that Mormons behaved. And the Mormons insisted that to be Mormon meant to be and do what they were doing. And so began a very long struggle, even a war, where the Mormons sought to redefine what it meant to be good Americans. And the Americans in turn sought to stop the Mormons from behaving like good Mormons. And so went the struggle. After a struggle, a war of many years, the Mormons failed to redefine what it meant to be a good American. And so the Mormons instead changed what it meant to be a good Mormon. From that moment on, in the eyes of the Americans, the Mormons began to become good Americans. And so the Mormons instead changed what it meant to be that good Mormon, and the war ceased. Yet in the eyes of many older Mormons, the Mormons ceased to be Mormons. Or rather, the Mormons became a different kind of Mormon. A kind of Mormon the older Mormons had thought impossible. And then a new generation was born. For the first time, these children found themselves born at once Mormons and Americans. These Mormon children found opportunities in America that their ancestors never dreamt of. Opportunities, acceptance, and power were dangled before their eyes. But they were haunted. Everywhere in this newfound world, they were haunted by the memories of their ancestors. They were mocked for their ancestors. These new American Mormons were not trusted because of their closeness, their similarity to their un-American ancestors. So these Mormon children then looked back upon the bodies of their ancestors from a new perspective, from the perspective of the Americans. These children of the Mormons looked at the un-American performances of their ancestors, and they were ashamed. Mormon men had sex with many different women. Even worse, these Mormon men married the women they were having sex with, for the whole world to know. Even worse, they canonized this deviant un-American sex in their scriptures as a requirement for salvation. This could never happen again. These American children of the Mormons, these Mormons torn between being Mormon and American, they looked again upon the bodies of their ancestors and saw them sacralizing indigenous people. Even worse, this sacralization of the indigenous was canonized in their scriptures repeatedly. Even though this white savior narrative was simply another form of colonialism, these American Mormons saw their Mormon ancestors as race traitors. And this could never be allowed to happen again. The Mormon children who wanted to be Americans looked upon the bodies of their ancestors a third time and saw them abolishing private property. The Mormons encouraged women to work outside the home, to be educated. Worse, their church financed the educations of women and encouraged their activism in support of their rights. These Mormons looked quite a bit like communist radicals. Worst of all, these things, which looked quite a bit like Marxism, were canonized in their scriptures. The American children of the Mormons saw their parents were anti-capitalist traitors. and gender traitors to boot. This could never be allowed to happen again. The children of the Mormons found themselves torn between being Mormon and American, and they wanted to be Americans more than they wanted to be Mormons. So they created systems a lot like the American systems designed to produce bodies of Mormons that would perform an American kind of Mormonism. And they changed what it meant to be Mormon and buried the memories. They wanted it to become impossible for anyone, any Mormon or any American, to ever remember a time when Mormons were not good Americans. Mormons then became American. And they grew in favor and in standing with the Americans and the world they governed. And then America began to rule the world. And the Mormons were anxious to be ruled and to rule alongside them. And so the American children of the Mormons soon forgot they'd ever been anything but American. And the years passed in relative peace. But then something happened. Something that happens everywhere and always and often in the world and in America. Somewhere something transcendent reached down, touched ground, and animated the bodies of people who previously, unquestioningly, performed as good Americans. The 1960s, the Bay Area, California. It was the dawning of the age of Aquarius, and not even the Mormons would sleep through it this time. The wildfire at Berkeley was kindled in equal terms by politics and the FBI, but at Stanford, the farm across the bay, a little slower to wrath, slower to awaken, the fires were sparked not by J. Edgar Hoover's ineptitude and paranoia, but by something far worse, something far more radical, perhaps the most dangerous thing America could ever possibly face. Someone was teaching Jesus at Stanford University. 3 people, theologians no less, were teaching Jesus at Stanford. And they were teaching Jesus, not teaching about Jesus. Though Stanford's charter forbade the university from allowing the 3 theologians to evangelize, the gentlemen elected instead to teach modern theology and ethics. They were teaching not what Jesus did, but what Jesus would do, which is to say they were teaching Christianity that followed Jesus to the end of Jesus' teachings. They were teaching applied Christianity, the most dangerous kind of Christianity. And the students were responding. Their religion courses quickly became some of the most popular courses on campus, with over 700 students registering for a single section each year. This absurdity, this total disregard for propriety was happening at a good American, secular, rigidly non-sectarian private university, a university which less than 15 years earlier had been publicly derided for the total lack of attention to religious affairs that its campus paid. And importantly, would not even have a full faculty or formal department of religious studies until 1973. But the 60s were what historians would later declare the golden decade of religion at Stanford University, characterized by what one astonished Stanford professor in 1969 described as an explosion in the objective study of religion unmatched in the history of American education. The student body was caught up and animated in a fervor of religion, which national media outlets declared one of Stanford's most adventurous intellectual disciplines. This renaissance of religion, as Time magazine christened it in 1966, had begun 4 years earlier in 1962 with the appointment of the ringleader theologian, a man named Robert McAfee Brown, who, while the Board of Trustees formally voted to hire him, was languishing in a jail cell in the American South for leading a civil rights march. And so when the students at Stanford were pollinated on the farm by the chaos at Berkeley across the bay, it should be no surprise that the theologians, the most popular professors on campus, became their greatest defenders. The theologians gave them religious justification for their protests. The theologians were standing on the barricades beside them, pleading their causes before the administration in religious terms, in defending the students to the broader public. Women's liberation, civil rights, gay liberation, it was all at Stanford in the 60s, and religion and the radical un-American teachings of these theologians were at the heart of it. Not the only voices, but leading voices on the barricades, in the marches, at the sit-ins. Religion gave the students the practical tools and the ethical justification for their opposition to everyday realities in America. To be American, they taught, did not always mean to be good. This was the Stanford of the 60s, where young Mormon Institute instructor Eugene England found himself. And though Gene, ostensibly at Stanford studying with the legendary Wallace Stegner, mentor to American luminaries from Wendell Berry to Sandra Day O'Connor, fell under the spell of McAfee Brown and became his teaching assistant. And Gene, the young Mormon graduate student, was transfixed and transformed. And so when Eugene England took the stage at BYU, more than 10 years later in 1979, to speak about God and education, he was simply applying what he learned at graduate school. And Gene taught Jesus, sure, but he also did other dangerous things like teach Joseph Smith. His legendary address, which has never been released to the public, has been represented in popular consciousness as simply a meditation on God as an eternal student. This is not correct. For you see, though sure Gene's talk discusses at length the then newly resurrected King Follett discourse, the idea of a God who learned to be God, it followed Joseph Smith's teachings to their logical conclusion. Perhaps most startlingly, Gene's address uses the teachings of Joseph Smith to answer the question posed by the title of his remarks, which was the Lord's University, ? For the titular question, is BYU the Lord's University? The answer Gene determines and guides his audience to is no. BYU is not the Lord's University. And how did Gene get there? Gene began by quoting Lorenzo Snow, as man as God once was, as God as man may be. Joseph Smith taught the fall of Adam and Eve was a good thing, Gene said, because only with free agency could the children of God become like God. When we forget that God's own journey to godhood involved learning and growing, Gene explained, we also forget that we are called to learn and to grow. Life, as Joseph Smith explained, was a positive universe of adventure. But at BYU, Gene beheld a university body in chains, where the administration regulated not merely class offerings, but the styles of hair and articles of clothing that could cover their bodies, but even the questions the students could ask and study in the religion courses. At BYU, students were not allowed to question. They were forced to be good. They were machines at BYU, not gods in embryo. Gene argued this plan of coercion over conversion was exactly the devil's plan, quote unquote. BYU was in flagrant violation of the restored teachings of Joseph Smith. BYU could not therefore be properly described as the Lord's University, or, both beautifully and terrifyingly, as Gene continued, not yet. Gene then implored the students of BYU to cast off from their minds the gloom, the depressing shadow that traditional American apostate concepts of God and pessimism about the earthly condition of man. Gene called upon the hymnal words of Parley Pratt, the morning breaks, the shadows flee, lo Zion's standard is unfurled, the dawning of a brighter day, majestic gathers on the world. And then Gene concluded, let us return to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Joseph, of Brigham, and Lorenzo. Gene was opening Pandora's box. He was invoking a return to an un-American Mormonism, a performance of Mormonism that held equal and compelling and conflicting claim upon the bodies of the Mormons. Gene's speech was nothing short of a direct assault and condemnation of J. Reuben Clark's famous The Charted Course of the Church and Education, which in 1938 had laid out the secular plan whereby Mormon youth were to be explicitly to be kept sound, obedient, and not converted. McConkie's overwhelming response seen from this perspective makes far more sense. The threat posed was not personal, but existential. Heaven forbid that BYU students get the same ideas as the students in Berkeley, to say nothing of the ideas in Nauvoo. But to focus on McConkie and the Mormons is to miss the forest for the trees. The Mormons were merely utilizing the biopolitical tools afforded them. Consider too the tools used at Stanford to bring the radicals there to heal. Stanford, like all secular American universities, was and is a machine designed to produce good American bodies. When Stanford found itself producing radicals who believed they could and should change the world, Stanford used different methods. Rather than yield to the calls of God and its student protesters, Stanford responded by forming a formal religious studies department and ensuring that theologians were removed from its faculty. Stanford, where unsecular religion had been both believed and applied, soon became a place where religion was only to be studied, not taught. In 1975, Robert McAfee Brown, the first and last of the three Musketeerian theologians, resigned from Stanford. The un-American became American once more. But lest it be forgot, 'twas in the 60s, this golden era of Stanford, this place of forgotten and most peculiar religious fervor, this burned over district, which inspired its students not to believe in Jesus, but to believe Jesus, which taught its students, like Joseph Smith did, that to be American did not mean to be good, which caused its students to become leaders in the civil rights, in the Black Panthers, and the anti-war movements, to found both the Esalen Institute and Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. The roots of Mormon studies are in this radical, un-American, unsecular activism, in no small part. It should be no surprise then that during a time when Mormonism was intent on performing as wholly American, that un-American, unsecular bodies gravitated towards dialogue and Mormon studies. In that time of concerted embodied forgetting, a new subsection of un-American Mormons took shape. And with their un-American performing bodies, they unburied and resurrected the un-American bodies of their ancestors. They staked their claim to belonging within an American Mormonism by demonstrating that the traditionally American Mormon body, then being encouraged by the American children of the Mormons, was not so traditional at all. It was here in the 60s at Stanford and beyond that some Mormons, like their unsecular, un-American ancestors, each developed, to quote the poet Ocean Vuong, skulls thick enough to keep the gentle curse of dreams. Dreams cause no small unpleasantness, both within and without Mormonism. It should be no surprise then that, like the authorities at Stanford and elsewhere, the American children of the Mormons responded in kind. So in a time when to be American meant to be powerful and capitalistic and racist and homophobic and transphobic and misogynistic and imperialistic, it should come as no surprise that the Mormons, after a struggle of their own, chose to be American. It should be no surprise that the American Mormons were stricken with shame at the thought of being perceived like the hippie radicals, the queers, the feminists, the communists, each more than a little like what their ancestors had been. Most Mormons wanted to be American more than they wanted to be Mormon, and they received their reward. But others who were exiled, cast down, cast out, cast aside, those with thick skulls kept the gentle curse of their dreams, and they too received their reward, and it shall not be taken from them. And so for a time, things grew quiet once more, and the Mormons grew in favor and in standing with the Americans and the world they governed. And the American children of the Mormons forgot they'd ever been anything but American. But then something happened, something which always happens. What it meant to be a good American began to change.
On August 23rd, 2021, Brigham Young University invited its faculty and staff to participate in a university conference to kick off the fall semester. President Kevin J. Worthen opened the meeting by announcing a new Office of Belonging designed to, quote, root out racism and combat prejudice of any kind, end quote. Worthen's talk was representative of an era of change at the university. 6 months earlier, BYU released a 63-page report that identified the, quote, sources and effects of racism at BYU, end quote, and included 26 specific recommendations, including the creation of an Office of Diversity and Belonging. Members of the university had expressed hope that the report would lead to, quote, real changes that make BYU a better, more inclusive place for all, end quote. However, immediately following President Worthen's remarks that seemed to signal the university was committed to becoming more inclusive, LDS Apostle Jeffrey R. Holland addressed the crowd. Referencing letters he had received from distressed members of the church, Elder Holland lamented, quote, you should know that some people in the extended community are feeling abandoned and betrayed by BYU. It seems that some professors are supporting ideas that many of us feel are contradictory to gospel principles, making it appear to be about like any other university our sons and daughters could have attended. Several parents have said they no longer want to send their children here or donate to the school, end quote. Seeming to accept the validity of their accusations from these letter writers, Holland expressed unease about reports that identified BYU programs and professors as radicalizing attitudes and destroying faith. Elder Holland quoted the late Apostle Neely Maxwell, warning that scholars at BYU must work with a, quote, trowel in one hand and a musket in the other, because scholars building the temple of learning must also pause on occasion to defend the kingdom, end quote. Elder Holland did not leave the intended direction of the muskets ambiguous. After a brief assurance that he and others in the church highest leadership were aware of the complicated feelings surrounding marriage and the same-sex topic on campus, the apostle also expressed indignation that a student had recently, quote, commandeered a graduation podium to announce his personal sexual orientation, end quote. This was a direct criticism of former student Maddie Easton for his April 2019 commencement speech, in which he used that opportunity to publicly declare that he was gay, a statement that was widely understood to have been approved by university administrators. Elder Holland also chastised the BYU community for its, quote, recent flag waving and parade holding, end quote, likely referencing BYU's first pride and other protests, because such activities were not in line with prophetic leadership and revealed doctrine. Students and other members of the Mormon community flocked to social media to share their disappointment, hurt, anger, and disgust. Elder Holland's speech appeared to be the antithesis of the spirit of inclusion and belonging described by President Worthing just minutes before. The disparity so striking it appeared intentional, a message that BYU would only go so far in its quest to increase belonging. During President Worthing's talk, Addison Jenkins, former president of the school's largest LGBTQ+ group and unofficial club, USGA, tweeted, quote, cautiously optimistic that this will lead to real, tangible, observable changes that make Brigham Young University a safer place for the thousands of people of color and LGBTQ students that study there each year, end quote. 2 hours later, he tweeted, quote, I'm taking this back unequivocally based on this talk that Elder Holland gave from the same pulpit minutes after Worthing, end quote. Calling Worthing's talk a bait and switch, Jenkins' observations of the contrast between the two addresses was shared by many in the university community. For many, the attitude of Worthing's talk juxtaposed to Holland's fiery address was disappointing but seemed familiar. Over the last decade and a half, significant changes around LGBTQ+ issues have occurred at BYU, but these changes have also been accompanied by anti-LGBTQ+ rhetoric and policies. My research explores how discussions at BYU on the part of administration, faculty, and students play out at the LDS Church's flagship university. Taylor Petrie's Tabernacles of Clay documents and theorizes about LDS teachings on sexuality and gender. Significantly, Petrie suggests the importance of BYU's role in the church's relationship with social issues. While other scholars have studied the way BYU's infamous aversion therapy program was influenced by church rhetoric at the time, Petrie asks further questions about the relationship. Moreover, he identifies important parallels between the church's approach to race and LGBTQ issues. Scholars who have studied the role BYU has played in the church's racial history have shown the significance of national perceptions of BYU's racism, as well as the importance of BYU faculty and administrators in perpetuating racial mythology. Their work shows the importance of and provides a model for looking at how social issues play out at BYU. My research centers on BYU's relationship with LGBTQ+ issues from 2007 to 2021. An examination of official BYU sources, faculty publications, student perspectives, and interviews with BYU community members demonstrate recurring patterns and conflicts within and between the BYU community and the church. These patterns reflect the ways that BYU has historically dealt with issues of race, and these parallels are crucial to understanding the process for social change within the university and the Mormon Church. First, I would like to discuss BYU's relationship with outside pressures. While my research examines several sources of external pressure on the university, I am unable to comment today on federal and other national pressures at the university with time constraints. I also did not have time to explore intersectional identities and like queer students of color at BYU, and also did not have time to delve deeply into trans issues at the university, but future research should examine these topics. In addition to national pressure, BYU receives a lot of feedback, especially on social issues from the Mormon community. For most universities, their larger community consists mostly of those on campus, alumni, and locals. However, because of BYU's unique position as a church university, many people with any connection to the LDS Church, whether that be Mormons, ex-Mormons, or other locals, are deeply invested in BYU's policies and decisions. Thus, when BYU or any of its faculty, staff, or administration makes decisions oppositional to popular community views, the university is bombarded with messages demanding change. In my interviews, I spoke with an administrator, a faculty member, and a student who had all been the targets of calling campaigns at the university. Renata Forsti, the international vice president at BYU, told of her experience hosting the first university-sanctioned panel on homosexuality in 2012. As a sociology department chair, she had approved the panel for a small sociology department-only event. Somehow, flyers advertising the event were posted in the Wilkinson Student Center. Outrage immediately followed. The university, the dean, and Dr. Forsti all received threatening and hateful phone calls, emails, voice messages, and letters demanding that the event be canceled. Community members have long been expressing their displeasure with decisions or individuals at the university. Richard Pohl, a history professor at BYU from 1948 to 1970, was the subject of many concerned letters to BYU President Ernest Wilkinson. In a letter reminiscent of the one Holland read in his recent address, one member wrote about Pohl, quote, "Many of our church members are happy that they can send their children to BYU so they won't be indoctrinated by liberal thinkers who make it a special point to discredit anti-communists and their publications," end quote. In 1963, Pohl invited Dorothy Marshall to speak about civil rights to a small group of graduate students. This decision was met with criticism from the community, who expressed concerns about Marshall's past affiliation with civil rights groups. Critics published letters in local papers to alert the community. Afterward, Wilkinson told Pohl that there was, quote, "little chance for his further advancement at the university," end quote. Pohl's critics were not exclusively found in lower levels of church membership. Apostle Ezra Taft Benson spoke to President Wilkinson, suggesting that BYU was in need of a, quote, "real house cleaning," end quote, to get rid of Pohl and other professors. Pohl also clashed with several other leaders, including then president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, Joseph Fielding Smith. Although he was a popular and effective teacher, by 1969, Pohl knew that his critics in the community and in church leadership had ensured that he would not advance any further in his career at the university and that his days at BYU might be numbered. So he resigned to accept a position at another university. Pohl's story is not unique. He is one of countless faculty members who have been fired or pushed out of BYU. Of course, we are all familiar with Mike Quinn's experience at the university. The fear of retaliation is a real and present danger to many faculty members at BYU. In my interviews with faculty, every single one of them brought up their concerns about getting fired. Several requested that I keep their comments anonymous. This dynamic is crucial in understanding faculty's role in social movements at the university. These fears come from BYU's sometimes contradicting positions as an institution of faith and an institution of scholarship and learning. BYU professors are supposed to hold up the doctrine and the principles of their faith while also publishing research that meets a disciplinary standard. Aaron Holmes, the director of the School of Family Life, explained that professors in the School of Family Life are expected to produce two kinds of publications: academic work that fits with the university standards as well as disciplinary standards, and what is called public scholarship, works that inform local and national audiences on family life, which includes, quote, engaging constructively on matters of core importance to BYU and the church, end quote. The 2020 Public Scholarship Report contains works published in the New York Times, the Institute for Family Studies, the Ensign, the Deseret News, etc. So BYU faculty are put in a unique position where they are expected to meet academic standards with their research and instruction, but also uphold the church's position on LGBTQ+ issues. How do faculty members respond to this tension? One of the many results of these stipulations is a growing split within faculty beliefs. Many faculty members and administrators discussed the split with me, but it was most apparent to me when walking past faculty offices. When walking through the halls of the Joseph F. Smith building, which hosts the humanities and social sciences, you'll see pride flags displayed outside many office doors, something not found in many of the other buildings at BYU. Professors gave two main reasons for this. First, professors in the humanities and social sciences often have to confront these issues in their academic studies. As universities professors, they are expected to contribute credible research to their fields which are often examining the experiences of LGBTQ+ people. Second, they talked about the impact of their interactions with students that identify as LGBTQ+. A meta-analysis of queer students in American higher education found that almost 40% of queer spectrum students were arts, humanities, or social sciences majors. So professors in these departments directly interact with more students who identify as LGBTQ+, meaning they will hear directly from queer students on their experiences and challenges. However, the split within faculty beliefs is not cleanly along department lines. Not all office doors in the Joseph F. Smith building display pride flags. One professor explained that his colleagues put up the church's family proclamation outside of their offices as a way to signal that they do not agree with the LGBTQ+ agenda and as a way to show disdain for the allied professors. Finally, I looked at the role of student voices in BYU's relationship with LGBTQ+ issues. Scholars have mostly found a lack of student push for change on issues of race at BYU during the 1960s and 70s. Unlike other universities at the time, BYU held no protests on campus about civil rights. However, student protest demonstrations at BYU about LGBTQ+ issues have happened regularly since 2019. Why are students so much more involved now than they were then? For one, the issue is more personal. A 2020 study found that 13.2% of BYU students identify as something besides strictly heterosexual. Contrastly, only 2 Black students attended BYU in 1965. Even currently, less than 1% of undergraduates at BYU are Black. Grace Solberg, a recent graduate from BYU, explained that people, quote, can't turn off their Blackness, end quote, but LGBTQ+ students have always been able to hide their queerness. Queer students have been able to covertly attend BYU in a way that Black students could not. For the most part, queer students can choose who knows about their marginalized identity. Thus, concerns about BYU's policies on LGBTQ+ issues have come from both external and internal sources, as queer students have invaded BYU from the inside. In addition to having more exposure to the queer community on campus, BYU students are much more connected to the outside world than they were 50 years ago. At Brown v. Board of Education, only 1/5 of the student population read another newspaper besides the Daily Universe, the school newspaper. News and opinions were filtered almost exclusively through campus sources. Now, the internet gives students access to news and opinions from all over the world with no interference from BYU or the church. Also provides a place for students to connect with each other. Countless social media platforms provide a place for students and other community members to make friends, spread information, and create support networks. On Instagram alone, dozens of accounts are dedicated solely to the queer community at BYU. Color the Campus, an extremely popular Instagram account, organizes Rainbow Day, where BYU students dress up in rainbow to show support for queer students at CES schools. Accounts like Honor Code Stories, which has 28.4 thousand followers on Instagram, address queer issues along with other problems at the university. Social media has also been used to share information about BYU's policies and its treatment of queer students. In early 2020, BYU removed the clause about homosexuality from its honor code, only keeping the clause that forbid all students from, quote, sexual relations outside of marriage between a man and a woman, end quote. This news quickly spread through social media, with multiple Twitter users reporting their conversations with the honor code office, confirming that queer students would be allowed to date at BYU. News organizations like the Washington Post quickly picked up the story and used social media posts from students as a main source of information. In their article, the Washington Post referenced 6 different social media accounts. However, 2 weeks later, BYU released a letter clarifying that same-sex romantic behavior was still against the honor code. The uproar on social media after this letter was released showed the other ways BYU students can use social media for social change. BYU's tweet announcing this clarification received over 1,000 replies and almost 2,000 quote tweets. Similarly, a few weeks ago, stories of BYU kicking students off campus for participating in Rainbow Day spread across social media, and within a few hours, the Salt Lake Tribune published an article about the event. BYU students use social media to have strategic meltdowns and hold the university accountable in ways that would otherwise be impossible for students that are disadvantaged in the power dynamic with the university. Social change within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints cannot be fully understood without looking at the part that BYU plays. Battles about LGBTQ+ issues are being fought at BYU, and the church's racial history suggests that the outcomes directly influence church policies and teachings. Thank you.
Can I just say, wow? You know, some of us who've been around for a long time out in the hall, we're talking about how today feels a little bit like the changing of the guards. You know, so many extraordinary young people have presented in this really refreshing, modern, interesting way. And I think this student session was just as good as it gets. And I was struck throughout it by a very different vantage point, right, on the historical past. Each presentation was so very different, but at its core, they were very brave. I think the really different shift to focus on media and Brianna, your presentation is so incredibly brave. Get to graduation, girl. But kudos to you. And I particularly love the last 3 pages where you were talking about the way the internet is a tool in social change movements. I think this is really powerful. And I think it reflects a youthful view on things in a really great way. Calvin's presentation, my goodness, it just knocked me off my feet. And I don't know if all of you are familiar with the spoken word. That is a kind of a new way of presenting and entertaining and exploring the arts. Calvin's presentation was very much from that whole way of doing things. And it was extraordinarily creative and powerful and moving and smart. And I mean, I cannot even read my cell phone. The fact he could just whip through that. You didn't have to move your glasses up and down your nose and embarrass yourself. I just was blown away, absolutely blown away. But again, it was a really modern way of doing it, really modern and very now. I mean, I don't know if you remember when I introduced him, he is up to his elbows in advocacy work. And boy, it shows. Really, really different view on things. And I loved Millie's presentation and the fact that she's uncovered this really interesting material about seer stones. And isn't it interesting that it's about women involved in those things? I think there's just so much there that I look forward to hearing more about in the future. So now what we're going to do is we're going to open for questions. And if a question comes up from the Zoom audience, Ben's going to take it from back there. So it won't be weird. If you ask a question, I'll repeat it. And then we'll let our wonderful panel of extraordinary change agents take your questions on. So first question, yes, back there.
I'll stand up. So I want to say what a beautiful homage to his work in terms of how it catapulted this, right?
Right.
This is the work that he started and all of your papers, which is like where we are now. And my question is, do you all have spaces to publish this, to present it? Because we need this. To me, honestly, there's a time of phenomenal in the field, there's a time to find this idea up. And being here makes me feel like we need to get together, right? So are there places where you're publishing this work that you're doing? Are there places that you're compensating? Where can one get this exposure so that
Are you on Twitter?
Okay, so let me repeat that. The point was made that this session was a beautiful homage to Michael Quinn's work, that he started this work, and this is the continuation of these questions he asked, this opening in terms of new kinds of topics. And then the question was really about, how are you getting this work out? How is it being disseminated? Are there venues that are publishing your type of work? I mean, Calvin's work, I want a copy of your script, but it was so much about this performance, wasn't it? And so what's the appropriate venue for that kind of material to go public? So really great questions, and let's see what your answers are.
Do we go there?
Yeah.
Anyone who would like to publish that paper is more than welcome to. No, just kidding. It's much longer. Oh, when I left some of it up here, I'm sorry. Yeah, I do sometimes. I'm active on Twitter a little bit as a researcher, and I also have an MFA in poetry. So I found my way into folklore by writing a lot of poetry about my own family lore and history. So I have more poetry published for sure at this point on Mormonism than essays, but yeah, hopefully soon. there's not a lot of Millie Tolses. So if you look me up on Twitter, that's it. That's me.
I am also on Twitter. But no, I think something that's been so beautiful for me is like I've, gone on my own, trips through the Mormon past, the Latter-day Saint past, whichever it is at this point now. But like, I've been so impressed with like the ways that like Mormons have, like, especially marginalized Mormons, the, unsecular Mormons came together and found, venues to publish and to help themselves. And so I've been, I think there's kind of like, we have this lack where it's like a lot of the older generation has these beautiful, wonderful storied places where they have these amazing archives and records of people that have been asking and interrogating these same questions that, if you're just raised in a conservative Mormon community, you think you're the first person to ask, why don't women have the priesthood? And you're like 15, and it's like, no, but everybody's been asking that basically since, 1830, like a long time. But I wish more than anything else that we could somehow move some of these platforms to be more accessible online, to like, so that people find this community and have the stuff. And it's like, we need this help. A lot of us, especially like queer scholars, we don't come from families that are supportive or have great backgrounds or have supportive institutions. BYU, bless BYU's heart. It is the Lord's university, bless everyone there, but it's not in the business of, helping kindle, the fire of faith and a Mormonism that doesn't look like Mitt Romney or Glenn Beck, I guess. So it's like we need this, we so desperately need people that are willing, I guess, to help us to have these places, to put these niches for that. So that'd be my appeal to everybody. Please, if you can help, I'd like to publish it somehow. I mean, if y'all liked it, like, okay, but anyways, thank you.
So I got very lucky, and my advisor is Rebecca Schweinitz, and so she has been campaigning hard for me to publish in Dialogue. So that is my goal eventually, but it is a long process and to get my paper to the point where I feel like it's ready. And if anyone wants to help me with editing, I would really like that. But yeah, I think probably Dialogue. I'm also on Twitter, and I think that is a good place to connect. So, yeah.
For everything that can be said about BYU, there is an intensity of persons and intellect that produces this. And there's something really wonderful about that. So many people in this room had some of their youth spent at BYU, and there's something there that I think produces really great opportunities for many people. Yes, Ben.
A couple of questions from online. One real quick, if you could just give a quick chronology of when this flags folklore come from. Like, if you know where it originated, and then the question for everyone, now you can ask it, what as an emerging scholar would you like the institutional LDS church to do to enhance their studies with current and early areas?
Okay, I'll start with the Peepstones. I know more about that. So with these particular stories, Parkinson married his second and third wives in like 66 and 67 or 68. And it seems like there was one family account by one of his daughters who came from either the second or third wife, but it wasn't the first wife, who said that he didn't tell them that story until he'd already married them, and then said, by the way, this weird thing happened, that's why I married you. And there are several kind of next generation stories where at least two of his children wrote a version of that story. I mean, the latest reiteration of that story I found was at least so far as the 1974. I recently found out though that there is a Facebook group for Parkinson family descendants, which I am not one, but I'm hoping I can infiltrate and kindly say I'm not one. But if this is still a story that's in oral circulation, that would be amazing. I know there are some stories about the Logan Peepstone woman that families still tell, that if she told your great grandmother who to marry, you might still have heard that story growing up. Was that the full question? And if anyone's interested in like women in Peepstone, I would start with Ian Barber's chapter in Women on Authority, Women as Natural Seers. Basically just that and Quinn at the end of early magical Mormonism. Those footnotes are really where I found context to support the stuff I was finding in the archive. What was the second question? What do I want the church to do? Just whatever sources I eventually hit them up for the archive would be great. I don't know that I at this point in my life, I don't have I don't have many requests of the church itself.
I don't know necessarily that I would want the church to do anything. I mean, maybe like just be happy and just like chill a little bit. I mean,
Maybe research funds.
yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to say. I mean, we have a lot of stuff happening, I think, in Mormon studies, but almost all of it always looks like endowed chairs. And I mean, that's wonderful. I'm like, yeah, I want you get a chair and you get a chair and you get a chair and everybody gets a chair. But it's like, I think what a lot of the students need is just like, it'd be wonderful if there was like scholarships and research assistantships and like fellowships and different things for graduate students. It feels like it's like we're getting a lot of stuff for these, the big name stuff, which I mean is wonderful. I get that a lot of rich people want their name on something beautiful and great and wonderful. But it's like it feels like there's a lot of the students wind up being left, kind of drowning a little bit. And just remember that stuff too.
Like Millie said, I think the biggest thing for me is probably sources. I spent a lot of time in the Wilkinson papers for this project, and those are more open than BYU and the church would like them to be because of some agreements with the family. But even still, there's a lot of things that are restricted that could be extremely influential and extremely important in understanding church history. So I guess just not restricting sources.
All right, another question. Aaron, a BYU alum.
Ouch.
No, you proved my point.
Actually, when Tom and I, the late Tom, when we left the graduate program, he went to Chicago. Todd said, I am so afraid that you guys will leave here and go to these other universities and learn just how broken you are. I hated that time. I think I still do. There are people I love who are still there and whose children are to say. Did any of you have any reservation at all about the paper you were about to deliver or in the preparation, knowing that, for example, there are those of us here who knew some of the Michael in the Eugene, you were really great friends and we love you. I know this is a hard question. How would you think that Michael might respond to your papers? Because there, like it or not, there is a big generation. Those of us who are moving along, there are those who would be afraid of it. I would raise flag of champions for you. If Mike were here, how would you feel about your presentation in his presence?
Okay, so two questions. First of all, did you have any concerns or reservations in the writing of your paper knowing you would present it here? And secondly, if you had presented it in the company of Michael, how might he have reacted?
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, all questions are optional. the second question was what Michael would have thought. The first question is reservations. I think mine was relatively low stakes because these stories are a little old at this point. But I did think about, and I was very conscious of this when I was writing my paper. I wanted to be respectful to the fact that these are family stories, and I have family stories that are also sort of could be maybe similarly like troubling in my own family narratives, or are problematic, or at least are very sticky and complicated. So I did want to be respectful to the fact that there are obviously descendants who maybe care about and love these stories, or just that is part of their family history, and I'm a scholar looking at that. I think I would have been a little bit more intimidated if Michael was here, just because his book was such a monumental starting point for me to contextualize what I had found in the archives about the Logan Peepstone woman and about women seers in general. That would have been amazing, but also definitely intimidating, I think, because his work is just so monumental in what I've been doing.
Like, yeah, first of all, these are two great questions. And I guess like for me, in terms of like how Mike, or I guess how Gene would have received my remarks, like I'd turn that question back and ask you. I am, of course, like I have great like honor and respect for everything that Mike did. Like, I mean, the thing for me that's so interesting being like a young queer scholar, a young queer Latter-day Saint scholar, is that I look at this and it's like for me, it was like my whole trips into Mormon studies came because, you know, I was trying to put together my circumstances and my situation. So it would be like if I would have, you know, been given the opportunity to meet Mike Quinn or to present with him, it would have been extraordinarily humbling, and I'd have hoped that what I did would have honored him. I mean, it didn't touch on him, only in very indirect ways, because I felt like, of course, that his passing is very recent and you know, it was emotional for a lot of us. And same, I guess, like, you know, in terms of, you know, talking about Gene, I mean, it's like Jody's right here. Jody as well has been like an extraordinarily transformative influence on me. And I, you know, finding Gene in the archives, I had the luxury, the privilege of working as Terrell Given's lead research assistant on that project. So it was like I've touched not quite every piece of paper Gene ever touched, but I've touched almost all of them. And like, it was like finding his legacy there was like the single most transformative experience of my life, reading what he wrote, what people wrote to him, what he wrote to them. And it was like, for me, it was like, and even beyond that, moving on into like the legacy of dialogue and to know this, like, I mean, it's like, I'm Martha Sontag Bradley's chairing my panel. What the heck? What? But it's like, I'm in this room with these giants, these people that I've written and carved this beautiful legacy and history. It's just an extraordinarily humbling experience. Like I am so grateful for y'all, for the sacrifices that you made. And it's like, I have the opportunity with my friends to stand here in this room because of y'all and for what you did. Anyways, thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah, I definitely want to echo what Calvin said. I think this is my first conference of this caliber, and I was extremely nervous because I look up to all of you. So as far as reservations, I think the reservations that I have had are probably pretty obvious. I am also a queer student at BYU, and with that comes a lot of complications, but I am very inspired by Mike Quinn and by Eugene England and other scholars that have gone before me who have recognized that telling the truth and talking about things that you're passionate about and doing your best to uncover the real story is worth making sacrifices for. And so I hope that Mike Quinn would be proud of that too.
Yes.
The help of moral letters, it's in good hands.
Yeah, I'd say. Yeah. Oh, any other questions? Yes, I'm sorry, I can't see your face back there.
Yeah, so I spent part of my, you know, I was there in the 90s when all the debates about it. And I found it very sorry. Found it in a lot of ways a great place, also very experienced. And in terms of beginning with the question about whether or not this is which university, by the time I was done with my bachelor's, I figured it is not, it could not ever be. And so I left. I went to graduate school in Virginia. And you know, now we're here. Sorry, I'm a lawyer. I speak in public all the time. I don't think I should. So briefly, I thought it was pretty moving. But now we're here all these years later, and we're seeing similar difficulties around some different issues, maybe, but the same kind of struggles that were there in the 90s. And I'm wondering, you know, what's your view of it? Do you think that BYU, as an institution of higher learning, can be saved? And is it worth it? Is it worth the struggle to stay there, to do this kind of work there, and attempt to make it to Liberty University? Or should we just leave it to the institutional church, let it be a monolith of homogeneity and sort of thought, and do this work also?
So that's a hard question to repeat. I was also there in the 90s, and this whole session, it rouses so many deep feelings, doesn't it? And I think part of the reason why that question you just asked is so hard to answer is it's different for each of us, right? And you know, the fact Brianna wrote this paper, it's meaningful to her in a way it might not be to someone else. And good for you. You know, we have to honor our own experiences and commitments and what we think is fair and good. And if it doesn't work for you, you shouldn't be there. But if you feel like there's a fight there that you need to be involved in, then you need to fight it, right? So the question, I think, at the end of the day is really, and, you know, we've been asking this question for a really long time, you know, should we fight to change BYU? And if you think about the relationship between Calvin's presentation and Brianna's, it's like this, isn't it? It's a circle where we went back and back and back. Should we fight to change it? Or at the end of the day, is it even worth it? So there's your question.
I do think that there is, in all of my studies of social issues at BYU, a thing that I found consistently surprising is that things do change at BYU and people can make differences at BYU. It's just slow, and happens a lot of times behind the scenes, and also doesn't always affect the whole institution. And so it is complicated and it's nuanced, but change does still happen. I think the question of if it's worth it, I think I will always support and love the people who are fighting to make change at BYU, but I do not think anyone should feel obligated to put themselves through the trauma of doing that, because BYU is a uniquely traumatic university to try to change, and it's yikes. So I think that it's important that we support the people who feel called to fight for that change, while also not expecting people to stay at the university to impact change, or to go to the university, with the specific intention of causing change. I think that it's important that we respect the differences between people's personalities and strengths.
And vis-a-vis like who should stay at BYU and do the work of changing it, I think, just if ye have desires to serve, ye are called to the work. That's what I'd say. Like BYU, I mean, it's just like, oh man, like the more I read Foucault, the more it's just like, oh boy, he would have a field day with this place. But it's like the thing that you're thinking of, like it's like that exact kind of like, I guess like as I've been like studying so much in like the Mormon past, like, and I tried to emphasize that in the way that like, the way that like my paper was structured. Change really is like cyclical, it's like the Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, that Patrick used in his essay, Politics of Mormon History. But it really is, it's like, it's a cyclical kind of movement, but it's like each time there's like this movement of, crushing down, but then the daffodils invariably rise again in springtime happens at BYU, these periods, of glasnost and all other sorts of stuff, but it's like, I like the thing that I keep returning to, and it's like, I had this wonderful professor who's like, he introduced me to this theorist also that kind of balances out Foucault, and it's become like my one of lately my anthem in life, Michel de Certeau. He used, Foucault's very, and this is, I think, the way that we a lot of times think about like hegemonic systems is like, the institution is structured bad, therefore all the people within it are bad and have no choice but to be bad. And like Certeau pushes back on that. He uses this beautiful imagery of New York City. And I was actually going to implement this in the draft of my essay, but I left it out for time constraints. But like, he uses compares the view from, he published this in 1980, but he compares the view from the top of the World Trade Center with the view on street level in New York City. And he compares, it's like, when you look out behind these windows, you see New York in extremes. You see everything geometric, everything exactly how the architects and the engineers designed it, everything's perfect, but you're behind these walls of glass, you see this lie. It's a lie. It's soundless. You don't see the city. You're up so high, you can't see the individual people going about their daily lives. So what you see is a lie in some respects, but that's the view that people in hegemonic systems have. But then he says at street level, and he compares it so beautifully, he's like, at street level, New York City is defined not by its buildings, but by the people that walk those streets. And this is the reality, that like in any sort of hegemonic system, regardless, to quote Audre Lorde's, amazing quote that, we could get into this all we want, but like about how the master's house can't be dismantled with master's tools. Well, regardless of the ethics of that, which is a whole other conversation, but it's like, what happens is that in hegemonic systems, everywhere, the master is everywhere perpetually terrified and worried that somewhere, somehow, in that house, someone is dismantling it using their own tools. And like, I can say that happens everywhere, even at BYU, a place so formidably structured, I think, at times to avoid that kind of thing from happening, that kind of change. And I think the daffodils will bloom forever. May they bloom forever, Edelweiss, that kind of thing. But anyways, I think we're not alone in something like this. And I think the other thing too is to remember that a lot of the times Mormonism just reproduces the exact same kind of trauma that the American government or elsewhere is inflicting too. So be mindful of that.
So as I try and wrap this up, I'd like all of us to remember and especially these young, wonderful young people, that you can use that ambition to change things in many different places in our lives. And if you even just use your last example of the view from up here, or the view from the street, you know, if you think of every point along the way where we're broken as an American people, not just as a private religious institution, but use that good energy to push for change in many different ways, and honor this ambition you have right now with your lives. So I think this was an extraordinary session. Will you please join me in thanking once more our student presenters? Thank you.
Send me a DM though, because I just followed you several times. So you're studying in London? Yeah. That's super. I would love to talk next year. Actually, oh, awesome. Nice to meet you. Hi. Aaron. That's whatever you decide. Is it for women? Is it usually a maiden name or is it usually a married name?